Try to remember your very first memory. For most people, it is a fragmented image. A birthday party with a specific cake. A family pet doing something silly. A summer day in a backyard. You were probably around 3 or 4 years old. But what happened before that? You learned to walk, which is a massive computational feat involving balance, physics, and muscle coordination. You learned to talk, deciphering complex acoustic patterns into meaning. You learned how the world works, gravity, object permanence, human faces. You experienced over 1,000 days of intense, rapid learning. You were essentially a supercomputer downloading the universe. And it is all completely gone. Why? You might think your brain just wasn't recording yet, that the hardware wasn't plugged in, that the memory drive was empty. But the real answer is far stranger. Your brain was recording everything perfectly. It was saving every face, every sound, every feeling. And then, it chose to delete it all. But if the brain was recording perfectly, why would it press delete? For decades, scientists believed that babies were blank slates. They thought memory didn't begin until a child could speak. Sigmund Freud called it infantile amnesia, blaming it on repressed traumas. But in the 1990s, a cognitive psychologist named Patricia Bauer decided to test this. She wanted to know if babies actually had memories. She couldn't interview them, so she used a clever trick called deferred imitation. She brought a 6-month-old baby into her lab. She handed them a strange, multi-part toy. It had a lever, a handle, and a button. Bauer showed the baby how to pull the lever, press the button, and make a sound. The baby watched. Then, 2 weeks later, Bauer brought the exact same toy back. The baby, who couldn't speak a single word, immediately reached out and performed the exact sequence of steps to make the sound. The baby remembered. Bauer proved that at 6 months old, your brain was already recording events. The hardware was perfectly functional. She ran the test again and again, mapping the exact timeline. At 6 months, babies could remember a sequence for 24 hours. At 9 months, they could remember for up to 5 weeks. At 20 months, they could remember for a full year. The memory circuits were clearly online. But if the hardware was working perfectly, why is the hard drive completely empty today? What exactly happened to those files? Bauer described the infant brain as a leaky bucket. Memories were being formed, but the mechanism to store them long-term was failing. The water was just pouring out the bottom. The problem was the connection between the hippocampus, which acts as a temporary buffer, and the cerebral cortex, which acts as the long-term hard drive. In infants, that connection is weak. The buffer overflows before the data can be saved. But why? What is the evolutionary advantage of forgetting your entire childhood? You might be thinking this sounds too convenient. You might think that babies just don't have language to anchor the memories, or that maybe Bauer's study was just one unusual group. But a second, completely independent piece of evidence from a different field of science revealed the real culprit. It wasn't about language. It was about construction. In 2014, a neuroscientist named Paul Frankland was studying memory in adult mice. He ran a standard test called the Morse water maze. He put adult mice in a small pool of cloudy water. The mice had to swim until they found a hidden platform just under the surface. Adult mice easily learned the maze. They swam straight to the platform every time. But then, Frankland did something unusual. He forced the adult mice to run on a wheel for several weeks. This triggered a massive spike in neurogenesis, the rapid birth of new neurons in the hippocampus. When he put these mice back in the water maze, they were completely lost. They had forgotten everything. Frankland realized something profound. In a growing brain, new neurons don't just sit there. They have to wire themselves into the existing circuits. And to do that, they actively overwrite the old memories. When you were a baby, your brain was producing roughly 1,000 new neurons every single second in the womb, and this massive construction project continued after birth. Your hippocampus was a chaotic building site. Every new neuron was a bulldozer, paving over the memories you had just formed. To prove this, Frankland gave baby mice a drug that slowed down neurogenesis. The baby mice suddenly started remembering things. Their memories stopped fading. Your brain wasn't failing to save your first words. It was actively deleting them to make room for the hardware upgrades. But what about the few fragments that did survive? What determines what gets paved over and what stays? The answer might lie in a concept called the cognitive self. In the 1990s, psychologist Mark Howe proposed that you cannot form an autobiographical memory until you have an autobiographical self. You need a concept of me as a continuous entity separate from the world. Before age 2, you don't have that. You are just a bundle of reactions. Howe found that the development of the cognitive self, usually around 18 to 24 months, directly predicts when a child's earliest memories will begin. You can't remember being a baby because there was no you in the memory to anchor it to. The camera was recording, but there was no filmmaker. But even after the cognitive self emerges, the memories are still fragile. How do they become permanent? Memory isn't just a video file. It is a story, and you need words to tell it. Robin Fivish, a psychologist at Emory University, spent decades studying how children learn to remember. She didn't just look at the children. She looked at the parents. Fivish ran a longitudinal study, tracking families over several years. She observed mothers talking to their young toddlers about past events. She found two distinct styles. Some mothers were highly elaborative. They asked questions. Do you remember the zoo? What did the elephant do? Was it big? They built a rich scaffold of words around the memory, adding emotion and context. Other mothers were low elaborative. They just stated facts. We went to the zoo. We saw an elephant. Fivish tracked these kids until they were 5 years old. The children with elaborative mothers had significantly earlier and clearer memories. They had formed a narrative. The children with low elaborative mothers had fewer memories, and they started later. You see, before you have language, your memories are raw, silent, emotion-only files. They are just sensory data, flashes of color, pulses of fear, bursts of warmth. But once your brain upgrades to a language-based operating system, it can't open the old files. The format is no longer supported. Your brain doesn't just translate the silent files. It deletes them. It replaces them with a verbal story, a narrative structure that makes sense to the adult brain. So if your brain deliberately destroyed the silent files and rebuilt its hardware, what exactly was it protecting you from? What happens if those early memories don't get deleted? You might be thinking that remembering everything would be a superpower, not a curse. But consider the rare condition known as highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM. The first documented case was a woman named Jill Price, who came to scientists in the early 2000s. Price could remember almost every single day of her life, starting from age 14. She could tell you what day of the week it was, what she wore, and what happened on a random Tuesday 20 years ago. Since then, fewer than 100 people have been identified with HSAM. Only about 1 in 10 million people have it. But there is a catch. Even for people with HSAM, their memories usually do not start until age 3 or 4. The infantile amnesia is still intact. Why? Because if you remembered everything from when you were a helpless infant, it would paralyze you. Think about what it was like. You were tiny. You had no control. You were entirely dependent on giant, unpredictable creatures. You experienced raw, overwhelming emotional terror over things like dropping a toy or being left in a crib for 5 minutes. If you could perfectly recall the confusion, the lack of agency, and the intense, raw fear of being a baby, it would flood your adult brain. You wouldn't be able to function. The amnesia is a shield. It lets you build a sense of self and ego without the crushing baggage of your most vulnerable, helpless days. It allows you to emerge at age 3 as a capable agent, not as a helpless infant. The deletion is an act of cognitive survival. You had to forget who you were to become who you are. But if this amnesia is so protective, why do we still feel the echoes of those forgotten years today? Even if you can't remember them, those early days wired your brain. The emotional patterns, the way you react to stress, the way you attach to others. Those pathways were carved before you could speak. They operate silently in the background of your adult life. This is implicit memory. Your body remembers the tone of voice your mother used, even if your mind doesn't remember the event. Your heart rate changes when you smell a certain soap. You feel a flash of anxiety in a specific type of light. Those are the deleted files, still running in the background. The hardware was overwritten, but the base code was already written into your nervous system. So try to remember your earliest memory. It feels like the beginning of your story. It feels like chapter 1. But it is actually just the first page your brain decided to let you read.